Hello, and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. Back in episode 7, I talked to Alexander Fitzgerald-Black about his MA thesis, which focused on the Allied air campaign in support of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, which, if you're interested, has now been released as a book, Eagles Over Husky. There's a link on the website. Alex and I have kept in touch and have always said we should do another episode together discussing the Mediterranean campaign. I was struggling to pin down a topic when Alex suggested I pick up a copy of Douglas Porch's book, The Path to Victory, which focuses on the Mediterranean theatre as a whole. It was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, so we've decided to look at the Mediterranean strategy. I appreciate that sounds a little unspecific. It was a vast theatre, but we'll see where it gets us. But before we start, I'd like to take a moment to thank all those people who have become patrons of the podcast. They help me find the time to work on the show. I hope you guys find the extras that I make exclusively available to patrons interesting. If you've not already signed up, it's super simple. Go to patreon.com/WWII podcast. By becoming a patron, you commit to $1 or $2 each month. In return, you can bask in the rosy glow of satisfaction from helping me fund the podcast, whilst listening to extras that I try to put out that are history related, but perhaps not that specific to the current topic. To find out more, go to patreon.com/WWII podcast. You'll find a short video there of me explaining how it works. Well, Alex, welcome back and congratulations on the book. Let's start by me posing this. It struck me that in 1940, Britain didn't so much have a strategy as a defence plan for the Mediterranean. The Germans had no plans, so it was up to the Italians, who had goals but seemed unsure of strategy. What do you think? Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. In 1940, but before the fall of France, Britain's in a pretty good situation in the Mediterranean, right? Because they have a significant fleet there. They've moved it from Malta to Alexandria because they realize that it's a bit vulnerable in the central Mediterranean, and the Italian fleet's very, very close at Taranto and elsewhere. But they're fairly secure. But then when France falls, things change because suddenly the central Mediterranean, which the French could contest fairly readily, is kind of up for grabs. And the Italians, just by virtue of having a fairly large fleet that's actually quite modern, are able to kind of take control of that area for a short time anyway. The British do they have a really good job at the Royal Navy in terms of using what assets they have very effectively, but they're not in a great position to do much. I mean, they can do some things offensively, and that's what ABC Admiral Cunningham does. He goes out and takes the offensive to the Italians very quickly and does win a couple of quick victories, especially at Taranto, for instance, with torpedo bombers hitting the Italian fleet at anchor. The British are really on a defensive posture here because they have just so many interests that are kind of all summed up by various aspects of this region, right? There's the oil fields in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq that they're very interested in, and there's of course some risks to those because there's some local Arab populations that are not behaving themselves according to the British anyway. Worries about the French forces that are still there, the Vichy French forces that are still in that area. But the Suez Canal offered a quicker route to India in the east and to get the oil from the Persian Gulf back to the UK or to Egypt, as the case may be. And this highway is under threat with the fall of France. And so the British have bases at both ends of the Mediterranean, in Alexandria and Gibraltar, and Malta's the lone bastion in the center, which is highly vulnerable, and it's a headache to supply, but in a good position to attack Italian lines of communication. So that's kind of the situation you have. And the way the Italians kind of always looked at it is that they're kind of set in the central Mediterranean, but they're kind of in jail. There's a bunch of bars around them. The British on either side and Malta in the center, and then the French as well. Now the French are gone, so there's many fewer bars there. But regardless, the Italians are in a bit of a precarious situation because Of course, a lot of their coal and oil comes from the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar and the Suez Canal, and the British can easily close those off to them. So the Italians are in a bit of a sticky situation. Their interest under Mussolini is to kind of create Mare Nostrum, like RC, and have an Italian empire on the other side of the Mediterranean. And that's what they start to try to do. But very quickly it becomes apparent that the Italians aren't really prepared for war. They've put too many resources into supporting Franco in Spain, and their forces aren't nearly as modern or as well trained as they would like. And early on in the war, the British are able to hold them back and actually push them back. I wouldn't say easily, but fairly surprisingly, I think, to a lot of people, because of course the British had just been pushed out of France at Dunkirk and everything. So it does offer an opportunity for the British to strike against the now European Axis.
What surprised me is that, and I believe I have a note saying interwar trade, only 9% of interwar trade went through Suez, and the whole area was kind of, I keep wanting to say demilitarized. I don't mean demilitarized. It's lightly defended because there's this belief that if we can do it by the air, so you don't necessarily pump a lot in, which sort of makes me question how actually strategically important was the Med. But I believe at the time of the fall of France, the British sent some of the Home Fleet to bolster the Med, which clearly indicates that if not the Chiefs of Staff's, Churchill believed in the power of the Med, or the strategic importance of the Med.
And obviously they realized the need to replace those French assets that they were going to rely on in the event of a conflict with the Italians, right? So, yeah, they considered it very important, and certainly Cunningham, the naval commander, considered it very important, and that's part of the reason why he moved his resources to Alexandria, because he wanted to get out from under Italian bombers and the sortying enemy fleet. It's not like they couldn't have gone around the tip of South Africa. It's just a matter of, it's much more efficient if you can go through the Mediterranean and the Suez, right? And that's a common thread that kind of spools itself through this conflict from 1940 to 1943.
Two things from past episodes of the podcast that I hadn't quite realised. So the aircraft, a lot of the aircraft came in from West Africa. We didn't resupply, so it didn't fly all the way around, which clearly is a shorter route. And yet we sent a terrific amount of traffic around South Africa just to be on the safe side, which then makes me sort of question about how important what was that as a trade route, and perhaps was it more important as the Mediterranean theatre from certainly the British point of view, rather than it being a trade route importance? Was it more important a psychological, a moral, a line in the sand that Churchill can draw, because it allows us to essentially be the only theatre where we can fight Germany? Without that theatre, we are not in any great direct contact with the enemy.
I think Porch makes a really good point in the book. While a complete British failure in the Mediterranean would probably not have led to Britain's removal from the war, because as you say, there are other economic solutions out there, it likely could have meant the fall of Churchill's government, partly because he was so big on holding it and using it as a way to say to the Americans, we're still in this war in an offensive capacity, and we intend to see this through. I mean, Churchill's decision to destroy as much of the French fleet as they could at Mers el-Kabir, once the French fleet said, no, we're not going to sail to North American waters, or no, we're not going to disarm ourselves. That's really, in 1940, that's really to show the Americans that, look, we're drawing a line in the sand here, and we do intend to keep fighting. The same was true of the situation in Greece, I think, as well, where the Italians had come into the Balkans, and basically after what eventually became the Eighth Army, it wasn't the Eighth Army yet, had pushed the Italians back across the Egyptian border and far into Cyrenaica and beyond. They sent the resources up to Greece to kind of support the Greek campaign. And of course, then, Hitler comes down with his troops in early 1941 and kind of ends that. But the idea is we need to support any country that's fighting the continental Axis powers, because we need to be seen to be helping these countries and in a position to do so, to show the United States in part that were willing to do what it takes to win this war. So yes, I do think it was a bit of a line in the sand that Churchill drew. He was always very proud when Tobruk didn't fall in 1941, and then in 1942 when Singapore falls earlier in the year, and Tobruk is added to this with Rommel's drive towards Egypt in the spring. That's a huge blow because he basically said, we're going to hold these two, bastions, and it didn't happen. I think Alexandria may, if the Germans and the Italians had been able to take it, may have been the final straw for the Churchill government. I don't think that means that the government in Britain would have capitulated entirely. I think they might have just had to work out who was going to lead the country further on into the war. I mean, the Labour Party wasn't defeatist or anything like that. They were fairly supportive of Churchill and continuing the war. So and by this time, America's in the war anyway, and the USSR is obviously in the war as well. And so maybe Britain wouldn't have been able to play as significant a role in the later years of the war if that had happened, but they still would have been in the war with the Americans and the Russians.
I wondered if strategically, when we look back, if that land campaign in North Africa gets the limelight, and actually the role of, I won't say the Navy because it's the Air Force is involved, but the military over the Mediterranean, that control of the Mediterranean was actually in many respects more vital than the fighting in North Africa, because very much so Rommel is on a very tenuous link, possibly even more, arguably more so than the British, where we could bring in our supplies via other routes.
Yeah, via other routes, and of course most of those other routes are not under threat from the Germans. Or once you get through the Atlantic and you start sailing south around the Cape there, you're in a pretty good situation, but they're looking pretty good, whereas Malta's literally sitting right in the middle of all the logistical routes, that the Italians and Germans need to sustain their forces in Libya and in North Africa. And of course, the distances, in terms of, from, Tripoli and Benghazi to even the Egyptian border are tremendous. Those distances from Tripoli to, say, Alexandria are kind of very comparable to the distances in Eastern Europe. With the Russians, the difference is there's not nearly as many forces there, and they're all kind of confined to the northern coast, essentially, except for some areas. And so logistics does make a huge difference, and it does seem like in this campaign, which lasted for 2+ years, the team that has the advantage is always the team that's closer to the logistical base.
Well, one thing that I picked up when I was reading through was the logistics. Is not just North Africa. It starts earlier than that, because I hadn't quite realised how Italy was completely short on fuel to start with, because everything had to come down from Romania. I think it's Romania. It's essentially Romania. So it has to come down through that route and then has to cross the. It's a huge distances to travel, where at any point, or perhaps not any point, but for much of those points, that could be something could happen to it. It's a very tenuous link, and it comes back to fuel. So even when the fuel gets to Rommel and he's halfway across the desert, it's got to get there. Just that fuel, just getting into Tripoli in itself is a feat through the huge distances it's had to travel. Because we all talk about the fuel in North Africa and Rommel running out of fuel, and I think it was just worth noting that fuel getting there in itself was a miracle.
Yeah, absolutely. Because of course, once they run the gauntlet through the Mediterranean, they also have to drive it all the way out. There's, very few rail lines or anything like that in this area of the world at this time. So they have to drive it all out thousands of kilometers to the front line. There's plenty of instances where the British, the RAF in particular, can interdict those supplies as well. And then you're, of course, spending fuel just to get it there. But for the British, where they have a relatively close supply, when you think about coming out of the Persian Gulf and into Egypt through the Suez, I think there's one point in Porch's book where he talks about how the British were literally washing their clothes and stuff in oil, because they had so much of it that it was water that was the real thing that they had to worry about, not so much the oil.
The Pacific is known as sort of a carrier camp where the carrier is king. In the Mediterranean, the British have two unsinkable carriers with their possessions of Gibraltar and Malta, which they can interdict from. Now, why is it? I mean, these are key positions, and the Axis must have realised this from the start. Why are they allowed to carry on operationally?
Very good question. Gibraltar's a bit of is much more difficult. It would have been much more difficult for them to do anything significant about, because there's a lot of politics involved. Of course, it's the center that allows the link between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean, and that's very important. The Allies control that, at least the Gibraltar side, for pretty much, for the entire war. But it was very, very, very difficult for the Italians or Germans to do much about it, because what they really needed was support from the Spanish dictator Franco to send troops through in order to isolate that fortress and ultimately take it. Certainly they watched the rock, the Gibraltar, closely. The Italians even raided it, just like they did. They sent some of their marine commandos to Alexandria to sink a number of Royal Navy ships. They did the same thing with Gibraltar. They tried to attack the island that way. They also bombed Gibraltar, but not in 1942. It got kind of heavy, but again, nothing compared to, say, Malta, for instance, because it was quite a fair distance, because of course Vichy France, they have their the Italians aren't really, I don't know if they're allowed to be based there or anything, so it's still quite a distance for the Italians to travel to Gibraltar, so they're not really able to isolate or knock out Gibraltar. But Malta was a bit different. The Italians probably could have taken the island quite easily in 1940, and it's kind of it's interesting that they didn't try, because there's very little there to stop them. Like, literally there was only a handful of outdated fighters there, and they had some anti-aircraft units, and sure, they had some army units, but if you put in a significant attack there's no way really for, I don't think, the British to stop them, short of sacrificing a bunch of the Royal Navy, and they're probably not in a position to do that at that point in the war.
They bomb it instead. It's why have I got 20-minute flying time from? That's
right. It's
Sicily?
I think it's only 50 or 60 kilometers from the tip of Sicily to the tip of Malta. And as a result of them not taking it early on, it meant that they had to use a lot of aerial assets in the central Mediterranean instead of at the front, instead of fighting the British in Libya and in Egypt, to blunt the island's effectiveness. Because, of course, its effectiveness kind of goes up and down, particularly depending on whether the Luftwaffe is around. They're sending Fliegerkorps 10 to Sicily to help with that, but then sometimes they send them to North Africa to help Rommel, and then sometimes they're back on the Eastern Front. So it really depends on where they're deploying their resources. The other opportunity they probably had to take the island was in 1941, when the Germans launched that large airborne assault on Crete. They probably could have done something similar instead. They would have had to choose between Crete or Malta, but they probably could have done that with Malta. And Crete's kind of a bit of a dead end, because, yes, while it provides you some basis to do reconnaissance and anti-shipping in the Eastern Mediterranean, you're not denying the British nearly as much as if you'd taken Malta and basically cut out their only bastion in the Central Mediterranean. Malta meant a lot more to Axis forces than did Crete. The third opportunity, which was probably the most seriously considered one, was in 1942 with Operation Hercules, which is a plan, I believe, for a July invasion of the island, again using significant German airborne assets, but also the Italian fleet and the Italian army. But instead of taking this opportunity, they instead decided to reinforce Rommel's victories in North Africa and diverted resources there into the push into Egypt. And the other thing was, Hitler was concerned about the losses suffered by his airborne forces in Crete and didn't really want a repeat of that. And so as a result, they decide again not to try to take Malta. And of course, Malta played a significant role throughout the war, helping in the destruction of 3/4 of the Italian merchant fleet. And it made, a long logistical tail all the more dangerous. And I like to talk about it served as an important staging ground eventually for Operation Husky, because the Allies would have had to recapture the island prior to the Sicilian invasion if they were going to do that.
I made a note, in 164 days up to May 1943, forces based on Malta had sunk 230 Axis ships, which says a lot for the importance of it, which I subsequently wondered if there's a lot of practical reasons why the Axis didn't invade Malta. I mean, they tried to bomb it into the Stone Age and fail, but I wondered if it just wasn't a high-profile enough target to throw a lot of resources at. Okay, it's strategically and tactically a fantastic place to take out that will aid their other theatres, but if you try to sell it to your public that we've just lost all these people, but hey, we've taken a piddly little island in the Med, everyone will go, what are you talking about? It's not like you've taken all of North Africa.
I think it's the same thing as with Crete, though. I mean, it's a much smaller island than Crete, but arguably it's of higher strategic significance. And so, they did it on the one hand, and I guess that experience told them that they didn't want to do it on the other. I know Malta would have been a lot, maybe not a lot. It wouldn't have been as large, perhaps, as an operation, but it would have been a lot. It would have been very bloody because, of course, there's not a lot of places for naval forces to land troops or anything like that. You are really relying on gliders and airborne troops to kind of secure airfields and then bring in reinforcements. That's probably the route they would have had to take in particular. For whatever reason, they opted not to follow that path.
And I think also, from the British point of view, it's much easier on the defensive, where you have core places that you have to hold. Where from the aggressor's side, well, where do you go from? Where do you need to get? There's so many targets. It makes it so much more difficult.
And I guess the other thing, which is an interesting point, is that the British did have to spend a lot of treasure, manpower, and resources to keep the island supplied, right? And so there's a bit of a balancing act that needs to be done there in terms of, yes, it was an awesome base for the British in terms of offensive operations, but there's a number of occasions in which they're not able to use it for offensive operations. In fact, it's very close to starvation at many instances, and so they need to supply it, and they take heavy losses supplying it as well. So there's that side of it as well. Maybe the Germans kind of sat up and said, well, we can keep inflicting heavy losses on their attempts to resupply it, and maybe that's good enough.
Have you read the Geoffrey Wellham book, First Light, where he talks about flying to Malta in his, I think it was Spitfire, and he's flying to Malta anyway he's sent to Malta, and they sent him there, and they removed all the ammunition when he flew over there, and he said, well, why is that? He said, well, you won't need it. Well, what are you going to put in instead? Well, we're going to fill your ammunition up with cigarettes, because space on the freighters going to Malta is so tight they can't get the cigarettes in, so we're going to just pack your plane full of cigarettes and fly you there, because they've got plenty of ammunition but they haven't got a lot of cigarettes.
I hadn't read his account, but I've read a number of accounts very similar to that of Canadian, British RAF air crews taking off from carriers, out in the central Mediterranean and getting to Malta. And of course, they did that on a number of occasions, especially when they wanted to get Spitfires onto the island, because of course in 1941, the island was basically a hurricane island. It didn't have any Spitfires yet. And the British actually kind of shot themselves in the foot a few times because they didn't have a system in place for turning those aircraft around. So I think it was in March 1942 when the kind of first Spitfires arrive, or maybe not the first batch, but one of the batches of Spitfires arrive. They actually aren't really ready, and so a lot of them are destroyed on the ground. But when they do it again in, I think, May 1942, they've got the system in place so that when the pilot lands, he gets out, there's already a pilot ready to go. He gets into the aircraft and takes off and starts fighting, essentially. And so there's a bit of a learning curve there for the British as well.
Do you think the Italians were at all prepared for the war? They had a sizable fleet.
I think their fleet was well prepared, but their commanders didn't quite take the initiative that they probably could have and should have. I mean, they did have the advantage in terms of numbers. So there's probably some instances in which they could have taken the offensive and done a bit more damage to the Royal Navy to prevent it from doing damage to them, which then by 1942, the Italian Navy basically just wants to sit in port and not really do too much. They're defending convoys going to North Africa, but they're taking heavy losses doing that as well. So I think, the Italian Navy is probably the best prepared, just like the Royal Navy was of the three services for the Italians in the Mediterranean. But it wasn't enough for them, I guess. And I can't speak in too much detail to that.
No, I pulled out some interesting shortcomings. Whilst I think they had about 300 subs, and it was one of the biggest submarine fleets in the world. They only had short periscopes, which meant the submarines were so close to the surface that they could more or less be seen, which amused me. I don't know where I got that. It was maybe in Porch.
Their radar, if they had it, wasn't as well developed as the British radar as well, and so the British could fight very well at night, whereas the Italians couldn't. And so Cunningham took good advantage of that in a number of night actions.
Matapan.
Yeah, I think the Battle of Cape Matapan. Yeah, that's one. Yeah. Absolutely.
Give them a drubbing. So the Americans come into the war. Now this is where it all sort of stands on its head, because it's Arcadia that they Churchill and Roosevelt come up with the idea of Europe first, but it very much more is when in practicality the Mediterranean first, which flies in the face of what George Marshall, the American Chief of Staff, he describes the decision to fight in the Mediterranean, the British decision to fight in the Mediterranean, as a prestige strategy and unsound. So why did the Americans allow themselves to go down? What I mean, is it? Do you think they go down a Mediterranean first strategy rather than a Europe first strategy?
I think that's the way a number of Americans have chosen to write about it and remember it. I think I would characterize it more as a European first policy through the Mediterranean. So in supporting Operation Torch, the invasion of Northwest Africa in November 1942, President Roosevelt essentially went against his generals' advice and sided with his ally, Churchill and his generals. And a big part of this was he understood the need to get Americans into the fight against the Germans relatively quickly. If this European first policy that he's announced is going to have public support, because ultimately, if the Americans are seen to not be doing very much in 1942, everybody's going to start saying, well, why aren't we putting all resources towards fighting the Japanese? Ultimately, they're the ones who attacked us. Hitler just declared war after the fact, right? The other thing is, because when they're making the decision to do Torch as well, things aren't going all that well for the British in the desert again, because Rommel's back on the roll. Gazella, the Eighth Army is given a really good shock, and that's after that, that's when Montgomery comes in and starts rebuilding things. What Torch will do is it means that Rommel's gains into Egypt or through Libya and into Egypt are kind of nullified, because all of a sudden a large force is going to be landing in his extreme rear, and they're going to be able to roll through and take out his logistical base. So that's a lot of the strategic thinking in terms of what's going on in early to mid 1942 that's driving this. The other part of it is that Marshall's only alternative, because there's really nowhere else that the Americans can get involved against the Germans, is basically a preemptive invasion of France in 1942. This is Operation Sledgehammer. Which is originally kind of thought as like an emergency plan. If the Russians look like they're going to collapse, we're going to land a bunch of forces, on the north coast of France to try to give them some relief. And Marshall didn't even expect that to work. He figured it would be a failure, but it would be something that was necessary in that instance. But of course, there's not enough U.S. soldiers really yet in mid-1942 to affect this. It's going to come down to the British soldiers that are left in the UK and Canadian soldiers that are going to have to share that fate. The British don't want anything to do with this. And of course, if they went to the Canadian government and said, hey, are you okay with this operation? They'd pretty much say no. They'd say, no, we're not sacrificing our troops for nothing. We're here to, provide that spearhead that's going to liberate France, not get killed in the process. Torch would also do a number of other things. It would deny enemy bases on the Atlantic coast and help with the Battle of the Atlantic. It would support, as I've said, the British against Rommel. It would basically, Porch says it basically makes El Alamein null and void. It didn't really matter what happened at El Alamein because of Torch. I don't know if I agree with that, but certainly Rommel was going to have to do something about this force that was suddenly threatening his logistical bases. North Africa would also give the Air Force new airfields to strike from in terms of attacking Italy, especially in Tunisia. It really projects out into the Mediterranean and has a lot of flat ground that you can use to build airfields to attack Sicily and mainland Italy. And of course, Vichy France has a big presence in Western Africa, and so there's the potential of getting those troops to turn and to side with you to liberate North Africa and potentially cross over the Med into Europe as well. So there's a lot of really good advantages, and Marshall really can't come up with any plan, because there isn't really one that makes any more sense. And so it makes sense that Roosevelt sides with Churchill on this, and that they do go ahead with Operation Torch.
It amused me that Eisenhower drew up a memorandum. Or Eisenhower is the man that draws up a memorandum that supports U.S. involvement in the Mediterranean, which I wondered how Marshall would have taken. And I think he believed it would be a buttress between Germany and Japan, as you said, keep the sea lanes open and keep communications between the USSR, or aid with the communications between the USSR and the Allies, presumably. Well, that was another way into Russia, wasn't it, rather than just going around the Archangel sort of route. So that comes down to little to lose and everything to gain, in the Med for the Americans.
Yeah, absolutely, and it provides them with a place where they can learn to fight the Germans. This goes back to even the First World War when the Americans kind of came in. They thought they knew what they were going to. They thought they knew how to fight the Germans, and it turns out they needed to learn a bit. They need to learn in the trenches. The same thing happens here, right? They get to come ashore. In most cases, they get to fight some French forces that sometimes put up a fairly stiff resistance, but in general, things fall quite easily. Then they move into Tunisia, and they do get a bloody nose at Kasserine Pass. And this process starts to allow them to start weeding out commanders that may not be suited, as well as to figure out what commanders would be suited. This is, the campaign in which, people like General Bradley and General Patton really come to the fore. It also provides Eisenhower, because Eisenhower's made the a commander of Operation Torch, and eventually the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in North Africa. It gives him an opportunity to start thinking through these problems of, like, how do you manage an international alliance? How do you deal with all the politics that happen as well? And so there's a lot of opportunities there, because what eventually happens, of course, is everybody hopes that the Allies are going to be able to get into Tunis very quickly and cut that off so that the Germans can't reinforce it or the Italians can't reinforce it. What ends up happening, though, is they're worried about Franco sealing the Straits of Gibraltar. And so they land on both the east and west sides of that strait. They land both in Algeria and in Morocco. And as a result, the force that lands in Algeria, which is closest to Tunisia, isn't as large as it otherwise may have been. And so that force isn't able to get to Tunis before meeting advanced German forces that are being sent there, and some Italian forces as well, to stop them. And so as a result, you end up with this winter war in Tunisia in, January, February, March, April 1943, that a number of historians, especially like folks like Stephen Ambrose, of Band of Brothers fame, he basically says that Operation Torch was a complete strategic failure because of this. But here's the problem with that, and I think Porch is absolutely right in his analysis, is once all this happened, and once Rommel had to retreat, from El Alamein into, towards and into Tunisia, and the Germans and Italians are sending reinforcements across the Mediterranean, suddenly you have a much bigger grab bag of Axis forces to fight and to capture than you otherwise would have. And so this actually ends up being quite a significant strategic coup on the part of the Allies, because they don't get to Tunis fast enough, but Hitler's willing to reinforce defeat. For instance, I think the Germans between November 1942, so around the time of Torch, and May 1943, they lose something like 2,400 aircraft in the Mediterranean, mostly regarding this campaign. Another great historian, Williamson Murray, an American historian, points out that it doesn't seem like 2,400 aircraft was worth the cost of keeping the Italians in the war in North Africa for an extra 4 months. That seems a pretty heavy price to pay, not to mention I think it's 230,000 troops, Italian and German, that surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. And then that doesn't even include the casualties that are incurred during the campaign for Tunisia as well. And so some of the Allied troops started referring to Tunisia as Tunisgrad, because it happened right on the heels of Stalingrad in the east. And there's an interesting connection there as well, because of course at Stalingrad, the Germans relied heavily on the Luftwaffe to keep the supply line open as long as possible for Paulus's 7th Army. And they try to do the same thing here in North Africa. And these two operations absolutely gut their transport fleet, because they're trying to reinforce, in Stalingrad, they're reinforcing an encircled army. And by the way, there's a lot of Italians. The Italian 8th Army is on the Eastern Front, very near Stalingrad, and they're almost wiped out. And so that's another blow to Italy at the same time as they're about to lose their entire North African empire, essentially, and be kicked off the continent. So Tunisia is a real big strategic coup for the Allies. I would argue, and Porch argues as well.
I would, if part of the problem the Allies is that it's not strategic. They have operational problems, as we've alluded to. They're smoothing out, whereas the problem with the Axis is it's too much of an ad hoc strategy, which allows for the Allies to be able to have the opportunity to iron out the operational problems. I
think that's a great way to summarize it, absolutely. Because, I mean, even one of the great things about North Africa for both Britain and for the United States, particularly for Britain, is the development of close air support. You had a great conversation with Mike Bechtold about a year ago about this, and how even in 1940 and 1941, the Royal Air Force was starting to figure out how we can best support the Army in the field, right? And key tenets like centralizing air power, getting air superiority, working behind the lines to interdict enemy troop movements and supplies, and the systems that actually make those things happen, as well as close air support, that's all developed in the Western Desert and then into Tunisia as well. And so it really does give the Allies the opportunity to iron out a lot of the problems that they have in terms of their doctrine and in terms of the way they wage war.
Something that I pulled out from, I'm not quite sure where, German historian Klaus Schmeider describes the Mediterranean as a strategic dead end for Germany. So I wondered, that got me thinking about the historiography of the campaign. And I wonder if we see it through nationalistic beer goggles. So certainly from the British point of view, in the British literature, it's the biggest thing happening in the war at the time. Yet, at one point, the Germans only had 4.5 divisions in North Africa and 175 in Russia, which kind of gives it some sort of idea of how much of a backwater it could be seen to be for the Germans. Do you think we have problems when looking at this with national bias? I mean, do the Americans look at it differently? And how is it viewed in Canada? I suspect the Canadian view is not dissimilar to the British.
I think you're right about that. Like you say, the British were really, in terms of the war against Germany, with the exception of course, the Battle of the Atlantic and Bomber Command and, raiding along the coast of France, this is the big theater in which they're engaging German forces. And yeah, you're right. They're only really fighting 4 or so German divisions. But there is a significant Luftwaffe presence as well. That's the interesting thing, of course, about the entire campaign is a lot of people love to talk about Rommel and his lightning-quick divisions. But the Italians actually, I think, they do a much better job under Rommel. He's employing them a bit more effectively, and they're providing most of the ground forces. Right, so it's not until Tunisia that the Germans start to outnumber the Italians, and so that's somewhat significant as well. But of course, the British and even the Americans, no one wants to talk about the Italians because we can beat them no problem. It's the Germans we're concerned about, and so I think that's common to both the British and American perspectives. Yeah, I think you're right. The Americans really only arrive in strength after Operation Torch, and very much the big thinkers in the American Joint Chiefs of Staff and everything are basically saying, "Oh, we don't even want to be here in the first place because it's it's not our idea. It's the British. We've kind of they feel like they've been hoodwinked into doing it, and so that's kind of the type of narrative that I think came through in much of the post-war literature, at least from the American side. But it's interesting because in more recent years, you've got Americans like Porch, like, I'm trying to think what his name is, Robert Ehlers, who's written a great history of the Mediterranean Air War, who are increasingly seeing the campaign more from, I think, the British perspective, not in terms of like the Western Desert, because the Western Desert still is a very British campaign, though the Americans actually were there in some ways. They actually had, I think, it was a group of or a group or two of bombers, light bombers, and a small kind of cross-section of their Air Force that was there kind of helping out a little bit. And they had some heavier bombers there later in 1942. But yeah, so I think the Americans have seen it as a diversion for quite a long time, but increasingly today, the latest literature seems to suggest that they're coming more on board with the British literature, which suggests that no, this campaign was a valuable diversion, and that it did support, the strategic vision to win the war and defeat Germany. So I think those two visions are kind of coming together, but each country still owns its own, own battles and its own history. So I think like El Alamein, you're hardly going to hear about that in America. That's just the reality, and you don't hear very much about it in Canada either, because we had some folks in the Air Force who were there, but we didn't contribute really any troops But then there's a lot of the other thing that's great about, El Alamein in the Western Desert, and we haven't talked about this yet, but it's also, the Mediterranean's also a place where the British can they can draw their empire to it, especially the empire in the Far East, where Australia is and India is. They can bring those forces in to have an impact in the fight against the European Axis. And so I think in countries like, maybe not so much India, because they have their own way of remembering the Second World War, but certainly in New Zealand and Australia, they very much remember, El Alamein and the Western Desert Campaign as well.
Yeah, that's very true. There's that apocryphal story about the British suggesting a toast to the Russians of El Alamein, and they'd never heard of it. And how many troops were involved? When the Russians hear about this, so that's not a battle, that's a skirmish.
Yeah, I think the British officer who was speaking with the Russians there, he inflated the numbers a significant. That's right. to make the Russians think that it was actually somewhat more significant. I mean, here's the thing about the Second World War in general. The thing is, the Second World War is a very attritional struggle, and I know we all often like to think about tanks moving and maneuvering about and decisive battles that change the nature of the war. And there's a lot of talk about turning points, of course, with like El Alamein and Stalingrad, for instance, and late in 1942. Those are kind of two battles that are seen as turning points, usually along with the Battle of Midway in the Pacific. With the exception, perhaps, of Midway, what you have to realize about the Second World War is in none of those battles, because there's the attrition of manpower and there's also the attrition of equipment and materiel, and none of those battles. Stalingrad obviously is much larger, but for instance, like El Alamein, it hardly registers as a percentage of German armored fighting vehicles destroyed during, in terms of their production in 1942. It's not the one battle that matters, it's the entire campaign that matters. And you put all the numbers together from all of those battles, you start to see the bigger picture of it's from November to May 1942 that those 2,400 German aircraft are destroyed, not during Operation Torch or not just as Tunis is liberated. It takes, that amount of time for there to be enough wastage in terms of machines breaking down or machines being forced, especially with aircraft when they're trying to ferry them from one place to another. You might lose a few, just from doing non-combat operations, right? And so it's the long view you sort of have to take in terms of the Second World War, I think.
Well, and I noted that it's almost a snail's pace the campaign seems to move at as it ebbs and flows before anything so really decisive happens, which is, as you say, is attritional. But that almost gives the idea or a feeling of pointlessness of them being there when nothing much feels to be happening, where actually it's constantly wearing down German and Axis supplies, which they can't replace as fast as we can, and especially once the US come on stream, we really are going great guns. But that sort of tarnishes our look of that North Africa campaign.
Yeah, and I think, not to jump ahead too much, but the same thing goes with Sicily, or Italy, I mean. North Africa, at least there were those big bounds across the desert, essentially when the armies weren't fighting one another, right? It's like one army's in retreat and the other army's in pursuit, and it's very, very difficult for an army in pursuit to actually catch the army that's in retreat. Whereas in Italy, there's a great German propaganda leaflet they dropped on Allied troops, and it shows a skeleton, and I'll send you a link of this so you see what it looks like afterwards. But it shows a skeleton over a map of Italy, and he's got a set of calipers in his bony fingers, and he's measuring the distance between Salerno and Cassino. And it also includes estimated dates of advances in the future based on the amount of time it took for them to go that first distance. And so it suggests that the Allies will have liberated all of Italy by April 1948. But what you ultimately have to understand is it's not necessarily about the distance traveled. Yes, there are certain places you want to capture, either for prestige, like Rome, or for aerodromes, like, for instance, the Foggia Plain or the area in northern Tunisia. That sort of thing, you do want to capture. But ultimately, the war is basically about bleeding the German army in a number of places, the Eastern Front being a massive one, the Italian theater being another one, so that operations like D-Day can occur and be successful.
I wondered if where the Allies went wrong was invading Sicily. It all went, not invading Sicily, invading Italy, sorry. All went right up to Sicily, at which point they controlled the Mediterranean. But once they go into Italy, it becomes a very much more of an attritional battle for the Allies rather than the Germans, who are on the defensive. They've always got a lot less, and it becomes a bit of a meat grinder for the Allies. And we could have potentially held them without having to invade, but they would have had to keep the same amount of forces there in case we invaded. How do you think that stacks up? Does that make sense as an assumption?
That makes sense, and I remember a number of years ago. It must have been 8 years ago. I went to a lecture by the professor Lee Windsor. He was visiting my university at the time, and he ended up being my MA supervisor. And he gave a talk about Sicily at Operation Husky and how valuable that was to the Allied war effort. And I agreed with him. Most of his point, the Italians, it basically knocks Italy out of the war. It makes the Mediterranean clear for Allied communications and for shipping, frees up a whole bunch of shipping because, you don't have to go around North Africa or South Africa anymore. But I asked him, but at what point in Italy do we start getting into that situation that you're talking about? At what point in Italy do we get to the point where the cost isn't worth the gain anymore because they're keeping us pinned down because we have more divisions there than the Germans do? And Lee Windsor, my professor's response was, really, that doesn't actually happen. And that was new news to me because I had always grown up I remember reading a book called The Blitzkrieg Myth by John Mosier. It's a very interesting book. He was an English professor, but obviously had interest in history, and he basically tries to kind of uncork what the Blitzkrieg was and to show that it really was a myth and it was more in people's minds than it was an actual fact. But anyway, he uses the Italian campaign as an example of this. When the Allies tried to apply the Blitzkrieg, it failed. And so that's kind of the mindset that I came into it with. But then when I started to read Porch and I started to listen to what my professor was teaching and the evidence that he brought forward, I found that that's really not the case at all. When the decision to cross into mainland Italy was made in August 1943, things were looking pretty good. Italy was on the verge of collapse. They would basically agree to surrender once the Allies landed. And Porch makes a good argument here. I think he says that the Allies couldn't just walk away and leave the Italians in the Axis camp. And there's a real value, of course, in knocking Italy out of the war because that's something like 34 divisions off the map that suddenly the Germans have to replace. Arguably, if they didn't keep going, they might have had a bunch of divisions sitting in a theater without anything to do because ultimately it's not until June 1944 that the true Second Front opens. So you've got a buildup of divisions both from North Africa and from the operation in Sicily that if you don't do anything with them, you're basically going to have them sit there for a while you eventually figure out how to transport them back. That's something they would have had to deal with if they didn't keep going into Italy. The Germans really weren't sure what they were going to do until Sicily kind of ended, because Rommel, who was in charge technically of all German forces, German army forces, the Wehrmacht in Italy, he suggested they should just retreat to the Alps and just hold the Alps, because you can do that with maybe 10 divisions or whatever. It's not going to cost you very much. But Kesselring was able to say, well, we were able to escape Sicily okay, so I think I could actually hold the Allies in this theater for quite a while. And so he makes a convincing argument, at least to Hitler, that suggests, no, we can actually hold further south, and what we'll do is we'll find a number of mountain passes at the points in Italy in which Italy is the narrowest, and we'll try to hold them, building solid defensive lines, and then build them in depth so that there's more than one line, and really make the Allies pay for things. Now that's obviously driving towards what you were talking about in terms of this is going to be a very bloody campaign for the Allies, but what it also means is that the Germans are committed to defending Italy, which means that they need to pull in a number of divisions to do that. And so even after Sicily, I think there's something like 12 to 15 German divisions either in Italy or already on their way to Italy, and that number will increase to between 20 and like 27, depending on what month you're talking about in 1943, 44, 45. It's only in really 45 that they start dropping below the threshold of 20. In addition to that, by taking the Foggia airfields out on the Adriatic coast of Italy, you're able to have a really large space where you can base the 15th Air Force, the U.S. 15th Air Force, our Army Air Force, so that they can do raids into Romania or behind the Eastern Front to impact either the Germans' oil supply or their lines of communication behind the Eastern Front, or into Germany itself. And so you're essentially opening a second air front that the Germans now have to reorient or duplicate their defenses to deal with. So that's a bit of a problem. It also provides the opportunity for the Allies to create an air force called the Balkan Air Force. And what the Balkan Air Force does is it supplies and supports the Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia who are operating against the Germans, who have now had to take over the occupation for a lot of Italian troops that were previously based in Greece and in the Balkans. And so the Germans end up sending, I think, something along the lines of like 24 divisions to the Balkans. So you've got between 20 and 25 divisions or so in Italy. You've got 20 plus to 25 divisions in the Balkans. And you also have 8 to 10 divisions in southern France in case the Allies decide that they want to invade there. So all told, you have about 20% of the German the German Wehrmacht, the German army or their military forces, concentrated against the Allies in the south. And that's a very significant number. And it was a very big part of the Allies' plan to keep those divisions there. And so to do that, they felt that they had to continue the advance into Italy.
And I forgot what I was going to say next. I suddenly ran through my head Catch-22. When you mentioned the bombing, I'm thinking, oh yeah, Catch-22.
Oh, great book. One of my favorites. The movie's not bad either.
Well, the movie's only good if you've read the book. I didn't think
that's right.
But there's lots of vignettes in Catch-22 that I then try to explain to people that I think are really funny, and then nobody thinks are funny because it don't work unless you read the whole Major and is it Major who goes to work every day, goes through the office, climbs back out the window, and then does something else, and comes back in, and it's wonderful.
And that book is part of a larger literature that came out after the Second World War that did reinforce this idea that the Italian campaign was a real slog, heavy casualties, First World War-like conditions in mountainous terrain, which basically means that Allied artillery, air, and sea power aren't as useful. All these things coalesce into this idea that the campaign was kind of a futile diversion, when in reality, I think the evidence shows that it was actually maybe not a strategic coup, but it was certainly very important to ensuring that other operations were successful.
Mm. Something that, again, Douglas Porch notes in his Path to Victory, the irony is that after all the effort the British do to protect Suez and the Middle East, within just over a decade, all that influence has gone. The British have lost control of Egypt, Palestine, and yet Marshall, not wanting to get involved in the USA in the Middle East, the Americans are still involved in the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's what they're left to do. And post-war Britain is no longer powerful enough. They do try to project their power in the area in some ways, but they're really not able to in the long term. And there's obviously issues in terms of the USSR and its influence in the region in terms of the Balkans and other places. And so the Americans kind of have to fill in for the British. And so I think Porch makes a very good argument that the real price to the Allies of this campaign, in addition to the casualties, it wasn't so much that it was a diversion for the Allies. It was that post-war, the entire war had made such a mess of the area that the status quo was no longer going to stand, I guess is a way to put it. And that British control over the Suez and other places was going to be on the wane. And that's, of course, a general outcome of the Second World War. You see India getting its independence shortly thereafter. And then France can no longer, in the next 20 years, realizes they can no longer really manage their colonies in the Far East, or even in North Africa as well. There's revolutions and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the political consequences of this campaign, which are significant.
I think I've been through everything. The only thing that I can't find where I wrote it now, but it struck me. I wonder how much Churchill, when he was looking at the Middle East, was the historian that he was looking at Wellington's Peninsular campaign, where he's fighting the French but not in France, and I wonder if that was running through Churchill's mind when he's planning his war in the Middle East. It's an indirect war as Britain fights.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of where his thinking might have one of its influences anyway. I mean, of course, most people associate Churchill and the Mediterranean with that whole soft underbelly concept, right? Which people believe means he was saying, oh, it's really easy. We can get up through Austria and the Alps to Germany, no problem. That's how we're going to win the war. In reality, I think Porch shows quite well that it was never about that. It was never about getting into Germany through Austria or anything like that. And it was always, after Husky, the strategic focus does shift to Overlord. I mean, ultimately, all the best commanders, at least the ones that have been made in the Mediterranean and in Sicily, Eisenhower, even Patton, although he's in a bit of trouble after the slapping incident and everything, Tedder, Conyngham, the tactical air commander, Montgomery, of course. Like, all these commanders by December 1943 are now in the UK getting ready for the ultimate knockout blow that the Allies are focused on. It's very much more of a shoestring. Yes, the Allies have to maintain a heavier tail in the Mediterranean because they have much longer logistics to deal with than the Germans do in northern and central Italy. But in terms of combat power, they're usually pretty even with the Germans in Italy, and only when they do things like, for instance, delay what was Operation Anvil, what became Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, only when they delay that and they keep forces for breaking the German defenses around Cassino and at Anzio in May and June 1944 do the Allies have a 1.5 to 1 ratio in terms of troops. Military theory essentially says you need a 3 to 1 ratio to defeat heavily defended enemy positions, and this is certainly what they were going through. And so they were still on kind of a shoestring budget, as it were, especially compared to Northwest Europe. And in Northwest Europe, people say, oh, well, when that front opens and Normandy's over and everybody's advancing towards the German border, and after Dragoon happens, well, maybe we should shut the Italian campaign down and put those forces into France. Well, Ike already has enough divisions to do what he needs to do. And in fact, you'd probably overload his command with them and in terms of the amount of supplies and everything you need to send them. So you still need to probably just maintain a presence in Italy and continue to push the Germans in that area. So there's a lot of logistical considerations around all of this, for sure. And they seem to indicate that the Allies made the right call.
Well, one of the peculiar logistic things that I picked up on was that the Americans, when they got cranked up, were moving at such a rate the British ports couldn't take the amount of stuff coming in. So the Mediterranean made a handy place where you could send people because there was just so much coming over when they got cranked up, which kind of blows your mind at how much material and men and material is coming from the US.
And not only that, of course, but when you open southern France up with Operation Dragoon, that provides you with another pipeline of resources that can come into France as well. As much as the Allies and the various generals were competing with one another, and they didn't always have nice things to say about one another, as much as they argued about the way the strategy should go, it seems like those arguments at least produced the right decisions in most circumstances. And as Porch argues, it's really not the strategy that's the Allies' problem. It's more the tactical and operational level where they come short. And then there's the famous Mark Clark deciding to go to Rome instead of cutting off the 14th. I think it was the 14th Army north of Cassino, because that's what Alexander wanted them to do. That was the whole part of the plan, was Operation Diadem. We strike out from Anzio and we cut the Germans off, and that's going to happen right before D-Day occurs. And ultimately, Clark decides that his prestige matters more than Alexander's plan, which is too bad.
Well, that's that. The commanders in the Med feeling second fiddle, feeling they've got to do something dramatic to make a name for them, whereas perhaps there's more chance in the Northwest Europe to make a name for yourself.
Got to get there before D-Day happens, because of course, right after D-Day, no one really sees much about the Italian campaign in the newspapers anymore. Rome falls, and on the 5th we have this big celebration, and then on the 6th the troops go ashore in Normandy, and the Italian campaign is relegated to more obscure history books, and everybody becomes the D-Day Dodgers.
D-Day Dodgers, yeah, very good. and with D-Day, that seems like a natural place to finish. Alex, thank you. Just to remind you, dear listener, Alex is recently published book is Eagles Over Husky, and you can listen to us talk about his MA thesis, on which it's based, in episode 7. If you want even more, Alex now works for the Juno Beach Centre and hosts their podcast. You can find that at junobeach.org. Patrons, watch out for more of Alex and I chatting. And if you're not already a patron, why not come on board? It's patreon.com/WW2podcasts. That's it for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.